everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Archives Live. I'm Bonnie Kane Wood, and with me, as always, is David Peters, head of the OSU Archives. How are you doing today, David?
Doing great. It's another beautiful day in Stillwater, Bonnie.
Of course it is. They're all beautiful days in Stillwater.
You bet.
Well, thank you to our audience for joining us. Many of our alums might recognize today's location. We are here in the mezzanine of Kerr Drummond Residence Hall, and that is because today's topic is the history of residential life on the OSU campus. Now, I have a few questions to get us started, but our live viewers are invited to share their own questions, and if you have a memory of your time living on campus, we would love to see that as well. Just add those to the comments section and we will do our best to answer those and share them during the live stream today. Now, let's go ahead and get started. David, I thought we would start at the very beginning.
Okay.
When did OSU first become a residential campus, and what did that look like when it first started?
So I'll take us back just a little bit further before that. So we enrolled our first students December 1891, or 76 students. By statehood, 1907, we're up to about 500 students, all right? But then immediately after that, by 1910, we're up to 1,000 students. So within a very short period of time of 3 or 4 years, we almost double again to 1,000. So before that point, most of our students had come from Stillwater and at least Payne County, and so we're staying in this area. But now as we're attracting more students from across the state, we need more housing for them. Some of the citizens of Stillwater didn't want the university to open up housing. They wanted to keep housing so the students have to pay them to stay there. But by 1909, we create 2 residence halls. 1909.
Okay.
We create a boys' dormitory. It was a 3-story structure that could house about 100 men. And then we create the domestic science building. And now this was on the first floor, was a dining hall for both the men and the women, and a gymnasium and a kitchen. And the second floor were the laboratories and classrooms for the domestic science or human sciences now. And then the top 2 floors were the dormitories for the women residents. So everyone would eat at the one dining hall, but each residence hall had the capacity for about 100 people, all right. And this is sufficient for a while. They're both on the eastern side of campus, and that's where the main campus was at that time. But by 1925-26, our population now reached about 2,500 students. And so they decided they needed to build 2 more residence halls. And once again, they built one for men and one for women. The women's residence hall is named for Jessie Thatcher, our first woman graduate. And it has, I think they each have a capacity for about 180 students.
Okay.
So now there's Thatcher Hall for women. And then the men's dormitory was named Hanner Hall for Carter C. Hanner. He was a former student at this university who served in World War I and died serving his country in World War I. And so they named that residence hall after him. That's the one that was recently removed to make room for the Spears expansion. So that's where those 2 were. And Thatcher Hall is still here. Okay. President Bennett arrives in the late 1920s. The campus is continuing to grow. He initiates his Bennett Plan in 1929, right before the Depression hits. So not much construction is going on, and it takes almost 7 years, 5 or 6 to get the funding in line, and then 7 years for our next residence hall to open, and that's Murray Hall. Murray Hall was the first building constructed under the Bennett Plan. Murray Hall is named for former Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray, a populist, also a racist, but the building was named for him, and in part the building was named for him because he was instrumental in making sure the funding from the state was secured, and so that was the bargain they were willing to make, is name the building after him. And then he supported both the combination of university funds, the state funds, and some federal funds from the federal government. So then Murray Hall goes up. Murray Hall is then dramatically larger. I think it has a capacity of almost 400 students. And so you can see the scale of these things is increasing dramatically. They had a little money left over, but President Bennett couldn't get any funding to build a new residence hall, but he could use that funding and some additional funding to make an addition to an existing residence hall. And so that's why we have North Murray Hall,
Okay.
which has a capacity for about 175. And that's why there's that little attached portico between the two. So North Murray is an addition to South Murray, and they were able to utilize that funding that had been approved for
Gotta
Murray
work the
Hall.
system.
Got to work the system. So I'm not sure how much, so I can keep going.
Well, I'm going to back you
Okay,
up a
back
little
me
bit.
up, back me up.
Those first men's dorm and women's dorm, would we recognize that kind of dorm setup? What did that look like? I'm assuming it's more of a traditional style with shared room and communal bathrooms. What did dorm life look like at the very beginning?
So the first boys' dorm, and it was later named for Crutchfield Hall, from one of the gentlemen who had stayed there, was just 3 floors, rooms on both sides of one hallway on each floor, 2 persons to a room.
Okay.
They would have 2 single beds, a chest of drawers, a closet, and a desk.
Okay.
That's it. And so, and we're talking about rooms that are roughly about 12 by 12, so that they're not real big. But that's what the men's side looked like. The women's wasn't much different. They had, actually the women's residence hall had 2 rooms which were designated if there was any health issues or disease issues. It was kind of the medical wing where these 2 rooms that had been set aside so they could separate them, and so they wouldn't, if it was contagious, no one else would be impacted by it. I'm not sure what they did with the men. They probably just sent them out to the barns, but the women also, it was a very small room. You shared a closet. You had a desk and 2 chairs and 2 beds and a chest of drawers, and you're home. And the first 2 halls really had very little social space associated with them. If the boys wanted to gather, usually they gathered outside, or they just gathered in small groups in the room. The women did have the dining hall downstairs, and so if they had a group meeting, that they could hold it down there. And they may have had a small parlor room where they could stay. And each residence hall then had a dorm matron or supervisor. And so there was a dorm matron for the women's residence hall and one for the men. So, but very, very, very simple. Hanner and Thatcher are really just a little bit larger versions of that same style. Central hallway, rooms on both sides, and both of those were, I think, 3 floors high also, and very small rooms. You shared it with someone, and the costs were very inexpensive. For the men and women in the first dormitories, it was $3 for the semester to stay there, and then you paid about $3.25 per week to have meals. And by the time Hanner and Thatcher are built, it's only like $22 a semester to stay there, and then you also had to pay for meals. So very inexpensive. Really, the construction of Murray Hall, you see a little bit of a change. So you have wings on the building, first of all. So it's not just one long floor. You've got wings that go out from each end. And then they had large parlor areas, designated social gathering areas. And so Murray Hall had a lovely parlor area. Generally, they have a piano, and people could gather, and someone would play and sing, but they had larger places for social gatherings and dances. And usually by then, most residence hall had a social coordinator, and they had a residence hall structure in place for officers. And so you'd have presidents and vice presidents elected for that residence hall. Oftentimes you had dorm floor representatives, and so the structure really begins to develop for the management of that and student participation in the management of those residence halls. But the rooms were a little bit bigger in Murray, and of course none of these are air conditioned still, and so but the rooms are a little bit bigger, and you now have these large social spaces in them, and that continues on with construction of Willard and Stout and Cordell, and that whole series from that era up and through the Bennett Hall area, which is a little bit north of campus. But those are very similar in style, shape, layout, and generally they'd have a cafeteria area, and then parlors and lounge areas. Occasionally there would be smaller parlors on individual floors. So if you just had a floor gathering, you just wanted to meet, they have a little area there. But
So most people will remember from their time on our campus or another, there being men's dorms and women's dorms. That's always been a natural kind of segmentation. When I was a student, we had the honors dorm. Have there been other special purpose dorms on our campus?
Mm-hmm. The first one that I can identify would be what we call Iba Hall now,
Yeah.
but originally it was the athletic dorm. And so they tried, and this was in the mid-60s, they tried to bring all of the student athletes together, male at the time, student athletes, into that one residence hall, which was Iba, constructed about 65, 66. And so you had, and even there they kind of had them grouped by floor. So I think the top 2 floors was mostly the football team. Then you had, basketball, track, and wrestling shared the bottom 2 floors. But that was the first attempt to gather one group together. And there you don't have really a male and female thing because we didn't have a lot of female athletes. We had female athletes, we didn't have scholarships and the teams to support that. So men had the advantage there of having the teams. So that's why there's the men's athletic dorm, which was Iba. Beginning in the 70s and 80s, you start having floors that have similar majors or backgrounds or interests, and those kind of take off from there. But we've actually, throughout the years, really been kind of eclectic in gathering people together. And so you can be selective in who you want to stay with now, kind of, your group. But often in the past, it was whoever came in the door was your roommate, and whoever was on the floor were your friends for that semester. And so there was a lot of mixing going on. So,
what about, like, we hear about Vet Village and married student housing? Were those true, like, designated communities, or was that more just sort of a self-formed communities around these areas?
So we're talking about student enrollment. Student enrollment kind of collapses during World War II. By 1943, I think we've got about 1,400 students on campus, so it's very, very small. But almost immediately after that, by 46, 47, our student population increases like 8 to 10,000 students. You have all these GI Bill, recipients of the GI Bill coming in. And we don't have the housing for that. We don't have housing for older adults with families. And so Vet Village, which most of which is, in fact, all of which is now gone, but was created in about a year's time. These were 16 by 16 foot hutments, no insulation. I think they had one light bulb in the center of the room. And even then, I think there was a sink in the corner, but you had a communal bathroom in another building. So you'd have to go out, in the winter, the summer, whatever it was. Anyway, very, very primitive. A few of them had 16 by 16, a double hutment. I guess if you had a few children, you got the double hutment. But that was all built northwest of campus. And we housed a lot of students up there. And they created their own, they had their own newspaper, they had their own government structure, they had a Vet Village mayor, they had their own little community center up there. They had nursery schools and student playground areas for children. So it really kind of was a separate community because most of these people were married and had families, and their needs and interests were different than your traditional, 18 to 22-year-old students. So that's our earliest, what you might consider apartment style housing. In the 1950s, they began building more housing for apartment style. And so those take off in the 50s and in the 60s. And so you get like the Brumley apartments and the older apartment style residence areas that are mostly in the northwest part of campus again, as they tried to kind of upgrade the initial apartments from Vet Village to something a little bit better. And so over time they made that transition.
Wonderful. Now, each of our residence halls is named after a person. Who are some of the people behind the hall names?
So I've mentioned some of the earlier ones. Stout Hall was named for Julia Stout. She was our former Dean of Women, and so a long-time staff member at Oklahoma State University. Willard Hall was named for Frances Willard, who was active in the women's temperance activities. I'm not sure she had, not that I can tell she had any connection to Oklahoma at all, but Willard Hall was named for her. Cordell Hall was named for a former head of our Board of Agriculture, Board of Regents. And so that was Cordell. Bennett Hall, of course, was named for Henry G. Bennett, former president. Iba Hall was named for Henry Payne Iba, former basketball coach and athletic director.
Oh, well, how appropriate that that was the
Athletic dorm.
Then.
Yep.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
I hadn't made that connection
yeah.
initially.
We're in Kerr Drummond right now.
Yeah.
Kerr is for Robert Kerr, a former senator from Oklahoma. Drummond is for Frederick Drummond, who was, I think, a graduate in the early 50s from Osage County. And then Wilhelm Hall North and South, which have been torn down now. But Wilhelm North, I think, was named for Susan Wilhelm, who was the wife of President Oliver S. Wilhelm. I think Wilhelm South was named for him. I think I had that right, because the North was the women's dorm and the South was the men's dorm. So then we have Scott Parker Wentz. Scott was named for Angelo C. Scott, one of our early presidents. He was president from about 1900 to about 1908. And then Parker was named for Quanah Parker, who was a Native American Comanche leader in southwest Oklahoma. And then Wentz was named for Lou Wentz, who was an oil man in north central Oklahoma near Ponca City. And Mr. Wentz was very generous in establishing a lot of scholarships, not just for Oklahoma State University, but the Wentz scholars are found in other locations too. And so that facility was named for him. I'm trying to think of who I've left out. I've mentioned Murray, Hanner and Thatcher. Crutchfield was the guy that the original boys dorm was named for. So I think that's most of them. If something else comes up, I'll give you a name.
If you are just now joining us, I am here with David Peters, and this is Archives Live. Today we are talking about the history of residential life on the OSU campus. So if you have a question you'd like to share with David, please add those to the comments. And if you have a memory of your time living on campus, we would love to see that as well. And just a quick note before we move on, it is business as usual in Kerr Drummond today. So you may hear and see a bit of background activity on today's live stream, but we just thought it was the perfect location for today's topic. Oh, right. On every campus, you're going to hear people complain about parking, right? But were students always allowed to bring their cars to our campus?
No. For a number of years, students could not bring cars on campus, and so either they had to park it off campus, or actually they weren't supposed to have a car at all, but if they did have one, they would park it off campus. Early students could keep their horses on campus, and so there was a small barn near Old Central.
So you could not park your car, but you could park your horse.
You could park your horse.
Okay.
And most students those early years didn't have cars anyway, but yes, horses we could accommodate, cars we could not. And if you have a chance to visit our campus, most of those residence halls, at the time, even Hanner and Thatcher, there was a lawn area between them, not a parking area. We look around Murray Hall and Willard Hall. There weren't parking areas around them. They were lawn and grass areas. And so they weren't designed for students to have cars at all. And most of the entertainment that students are attending are going to be, especially after the student union is constructed, is just right over there. They don't need a car to go there. And also there was business districts around the campus. So you had Washington Street was a business district, Knobloch had a business district, Elm developed a business district. And so you had these business districts, especially in the southeast corner of campus. And so people would just walk. They didn't really need a car. And so there was grumbling of students who had cars and wanted to bring them on campus. It's not really until after World War II that there's really a large demand or a growing demand for students to park cars. You know, back in those earlier years, especially during the Depression, students didn't have cars. It was rare for a student to have a car. But after World War II, the whole demographics changed. And so there's more and more of a desire for people to have mobility, especially if you live out at Vet Village and you needed to get someplace. A car was your best way to go. So it's in the 50s and 60s that we began thinking of parking. And when they build this complex of Kerr Drummond, Wilhelm, Scott Parker Wentz, Iba, they really are planning for parking. And so initially that whole area between these buildings was just a big parking area for students. And
so when did students start bringing their cars to campus?
After World War II,
Okay.
They really couldn't prevent. A lot of things changed after World War II because you're dealing with an older student population.
Yeah.
And so you have men and women who are married and have children. And how do you tell them you can't have a car? They're a freshman just like that other freshman. So then the other freshman who doesn't have a family is saying, well, they have a car. How come I can't have a car? And pretty soon the floodgates open and we have cars. And then more and more students are able to afford cars. But even I started college in the early 70s, and I had friends who didn't have cars.
Sure.
It just wasn't assumed you'd have a car. So now it's assumed you will have a car and maybe a boat or something else.
So we have a question from William. He asks, when did it become required for freshmen to live on campus? So now, if you're not living with a family member, I believe it's required for our incoming freshmen to live on campus. When did that start?
That change occurred with the opening of Murray Hall.
Okay, so very early on.
So 1935, 36. So all a part of the funding mechanism was that student fees, the boarding fees, would be collected to repay the bonds that were used to build the building. And so they had to they didn't have to, but they mandated that especially freshmen lived on campus. So they would insure themselves a certain number of students who would live then in Murray Hall and pay these fees that then go to pay off the bonds. So that began in 1935. And that rule has really continued to the present day. You've got to have all kinds of special dispensation if you choose not to live on campus as a freshman. But it's possible. But we actually try to encourage people to live on campus housing or in the Greek housing, but to help them build a community. I mean, it's really important for them to begin establishing social relationships that they can tie themselves to that last longer than just moving in and out of apartments all the time. So I think it's good to encourage students to live in residence halls if they can.
Yeah. Now, I know when I was a student, I lived on campus my freshman year in Drummond, right over here, actually. And when I was a student, one of my biggest complaints was some of the rules that we were subjected to in the residence halls. So I'm wondering if you could tell us about what some of the past rules are that might seem surprising today.
So, let's start with a surprising one. Until the 60s, men and women had different sets of rules. And so men's residence halls, you could come and go whenever you wished. Women's residence hall had specific hours where you had to be in the hall. I can't remember, it was probably by 9 or 10 o'clock at night, you had to be in the hall because they would lock it up.
Sleeping on the sidewalk if you don't get in, huh?
That's right. I'm not sure what you'd do if you didn't make it in. I guess appeal to the dorm residence hall matron. But anyway, so women had much more restricted in their hours than men were. Men could come and go as they pleased. Early on, you couldn't have any kind of, you didn't have the electrical support for any kind of appliances or anything like that. So you couldn't have refrigerators. You couldn't even have hot plates or and this is before microwaves, that kind of thing. But you couldn't have a lot of other things that students think of now of having, TVs and that kind of stuff. So couldn't have any of that kind of stuff. Of course, no alcohol has always been a rule for campus, and no visitation for members of the opposite sex. And so even the men whose residence hall was open, 24/7 probably, they couldn't have young women come visit them in their rooms. Occasionally, there would be open houses where they could visit. It's not until the 1960s that they began to equalize how they treat men and women in the residential living. And that was really brought about by a number of issues that were going on campus. And they began to address that because students brought it to their attention that it was unfair. It was discriminatory. And so they began addressing it then. And in the late 60s, they began having more open houses on residence halls on campus too. So Sunday afternoon would be just a standard open house. And so you could have, men visiting women's dormitory floors, not just in the social areas, the lounges and parlors, but up in their rooms. And same thing with women in the men's residence halls. And now it's a free-for-all. But they would have never thought of having, men and women in the same residence hall, even if they were on different floors. That just wouldn't have wouldn't have passed inspection. So they've really they've just opened it up to more diversity within the residence halls now, which is interesting and probably increases new dynamics of students getting along with each other.
Sure. Yes, when I was a student, we were not allowed to rollerblade in the hallways, which is probably a sure sign that I was an undergraduate in the 90s. And we were only allowed to have pets that could survive underwater for 3 minutes or longer. So.
I do remember when they first built these high-rise residence halls, the Kerr Drummond and the Wilhelm North and South, and then of course Wentz, but floor or residence halls that were more than 4 or 5 stories high. Invariably, there would be people selling elevator tickets to freshmen coming in, and they would sell them these tickets. They said in order to ride the elevator, you had to have, so you could buy like a punch card for elevator tickets for like $1. And of course, it was just a ruse on freshmen, but
little prank there.
Yeah.
If you are just now joining us, this is Archives Live. I'm here with David Peters, head of the OSU Archives, and we are talking about the history of residential life on the OSU campus. If you have some questions you would like us to answer on today's live stream, please share those in the comment section. And if you have a story or memory of your time here at OSU living on campus, we would love to see those as well. So just a couple more questions here, David. I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit about the architecture of the residence halls and how it's evolved or maybe hasn't over the years.
So the first thing is the scale. So I talked about early on, these were very small initially, and they've grown progressively larger. They've adjusted for social interaction outside of just a motel row of rooms, and so that has changed. But they went from they started off as really fairly simple structures to more elaborate and inclusive structures. And so if you ever have a chance, in fact, we have a history pin tour that people can see, where they can kind of tour and they can see how these buildings have evolved over time. But usually they stayed within 4 floors or so. It's not until the 70s, when we have the 60s and 70s, we have the baby boom arrive, that we begin what are these tall structures, where you have 10, 11, 12, 14 stories high. And when they did that, you have okay, let me back up. So you have the mezzanine like we're in right now, which was a social gathering point for everyone in both Kerr and Drummond. And it had the same thing at Wilhelm. And they've got a very similar format, Scott Parker Wentz. But then the individual floors, you'd have rooms all around the outside, but then you had 2 hallways. And then in the center between those hallways, that's where you'd have your utility closets, but you'd also have lounges and little kitchens and little parlors. And so they tried to create these smaller communities on each floor because it's almost impossible to have the whole community gather. Their scale got to the point where it was impossible for the whole group to get together, really. And so they made that adjustment to providing more social space on each floor. And what we've done now with our more recent apartments, because students have changed, when in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, many students had to share a room growing up, and so they didn't think anything of sharing a room. Now, when they went to college, many of our students today haven't necessarily shared a room, or they're not used to sharing facilities with someone. And so now, oftentimes, the apartments have individual bedrooms, and then they may have a shared social space. And so we've adjusted to the demographics of our population and the experiences of our population over time. And the new residence halls are apartments rather than traditional, what I call residence hall boxes. So I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but
that's great.
But if you notice, the newer apartments are back to the 4 floors high or so. They're not these tall mammoth things, and really that was to scale up for the baby boom. But that period is now gone, and the demographics have changed, and so we're going to apartment style living.
Wonderful. Now, you mentioned a history pin tour of our residence halls, and I believe we have it pulled up here on the tablet. Would you like to just show us a little bit, maybe tell the audience what is history pin as we take a look at some of our photos?
Okay, so history pin is kind of based on a Google Maps platform, and so you take Google Maps, and then you can place images at certain locations where things were or still are. And so what we've done is we created a series of tours of campus on different themes, and one of our themes is a tour of current and former residence halls on campus. And so people can go into that. Let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger. And then we're gonna, as you zoom into campus, and you can select, they're listed, there's like little pins you should put on a physical map, and you can select a pin. Well, I thought you could select a pin. Yeah, I'm having a little challenge here.
Our touchscreen not cooperating with you.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what I've done, but all the little pins here are attached to information, a picture, and then a description of that residence hall. And so you can take a tour through here. Let me back out here and see if I can. Well, I'm stuck now. Let's try it this way. Okay, so we're going to alter it here a bit. So what I'm going to do is I've now zoomed into the map on the right-hand side, and then as you select like Hanner Hall, it's going to highlight where Hanner Hall is. So it's number 2 on this particular map. As we move through here, then we have Murray and North Murray Hall, and so you can just kind of scroll through the residence halls, and then it gives you a location of where those are on the map. You can see how they've changed, how they've positioned themselves over time. But it's a fairly complete coverage for especially what we call classic residence halls on campus, and many of which have been converted to other purposes too. Thatcher is used from ROTC. Willard Hall was converted for education, College of Education. So, but it gives you a chance to view those buildings and facilities, and you can see where they're placed on campus through History Pin. So, sorry I didn't demonstrate it very well, but hopefully they can find it and enjoy it. And then there's other tours of facilities on campus too.
Yeah, and so our History Pin tours are one of the many projects that we have interns working on at the OSU Library. So we have a number of historic tours of campus. So if you enjoy a Google Map tour of various places, you might enjoy some of our historical tours we've built there of campus. Okay, David, one last question before we go. If people want to learn more about living on campus and what that has looked like throughout OSU's history, what do we have in the archives that might be of interest to them?
So we have a large photographic collection. So we have a lot of pictures of the outside of the buildings. We have some pictures of the insides, some of the dormitory rooms, residence hall rooms, and social areas within those, the lounges and parlors. So we have the photo collections. We have all of the old college catalogs, and oftentimes there's a section in there about residence halls. You find out about the costs and what was available, and the construction of these. And they really were proud of the residence hall construction. And then we have records for some of the individual residence halls where we have collected materials for those. And so, and then there's several books in the Centennial History series that are available online, but then we also have those in the archives, and we have the resource material that those books were based on that we can go back. And so if there are certain sources that they are highlighting, we can pull those sources out for them and they can see where that information came from. So we have several layers of information provided for residence halls. And then we also have some of the early students were given a little suggestions for proper behavior, but little etiquette books. And it describes life in the residence halls and things that they could do, not just in residence halls, but on campus. So how they would learn to behave properly. And so, but we have those kinds of things.
An early cowboy code.
An early cowboy code.
Wonderful.
And so, but We'd love to visit with anyone about their experiences in residence halls on and off campus. You probably should include the Greek community too, but we'll have information about living on campus or near campus. And we think it's probably been very meaningful for a lot of people to still identify with the residence hall or halls they lived in.
So if I've never done research with the OSU archives before, how do I get started?
So you can find us online on the library website. You can just go to the archives department. There's a form they can fill out and they can contact us that way by email or phone. We have reference hours during the summer. They're just from 10 to 3, but we're willing to come in early or stay late if that's better for you. Then normally during the year, Monday through Friday, we're open 8 to 5. Please let us know beforehand if you can that you're coming. So if there's materials that we have housed at our other locations, we can gather those together and bring them to the library. Our offices are located on the second floor, east side of Edmund Lowe Library. We'd love to have people visit us there. They can call or email, and we'll try to respond as quickly as possible.
Wonderful. Well, David, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Thank you to the Residential Life staff for hosting us in this location. We very much appreciate that. And of course, thank you to our viewers for joining us, for asking questions, for joining in on that conversation in the comments. Please keep it going on the rebroadcast of the stream. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, continue to comment, and we can engage with you there. If you would like to see more videos from the archives, you can find those on OState TV as well as our YouTube channel. The websites for all of those will be listed at the end of this program. Thanks again to everyone for watching, and we will see you next month on Archives Live.